Along the Santa Fe Trail.
God bless America. God bless you all. That's life.
Georgia.
I said Georgia.
Oh, the humanity.
You load 16 tons.
Gotta jump down, spin around and pick a bale of cotton. Gotta jump down, spin around and pick a bale of day.
All day, all night, Marianne.
And then I made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Time now for spinning my dad's vinyl. Here, with all his skips, scratches, and pops, is my dad, Frank Vaccarello.
Thanks, sweetie, and thank you for tuning in to episode 227 of Spinning My Dad's Vinyl. We now pull out the third record from this 7-record box set, a record that features a relatively unknown work and probably one of the most famous works in music history. Talk about a dichotomy. This is music from the immortal Ludwig van Beethoven. His symphonies live on in performances to this very day. Plus, I decided to play 3 movements from each symphony. I thought this joint needed some classing up. So, settle in and get ready to hear the man who is said to have set music free in Volume 227, Beethoven's 4th and 5th. the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra with the Beecham Choral Society, under the direction of René Leibovitz, performing Ludwig van Beethoven's first movement, Adagio Allegro Vivace, of his Symphony No. 4 in B-flat major, Opus 60. Now, this is the fourth published symphony by Beethoven. It was composed in 1806 and premiered in March 1807 at a private concert in Vienna at the townhouse of Prince Lobkowitz. The first public performance was at the Berg Theater in Vienna in April 1808. Now, the symphony is in 4 movements. It is predominantly genial in tone and has tended to be overshadowed by the weightier Beethoven symphonies that preceded and followed it, the Third Symphony, Eroica, and the Fifth. Although later composers, including Berlioz, Mendelssohn, and Schumann, greatly admired the work, it has not become as widely known among the music-loving public as the Eroica, the Fifth, and other Beethoven symphonies. Okay, why this record for this episode? Well, this is one of those box sets I kept passing over during the first 3 seasons, and I have no real excuse other than I was enjoying the jazz and other types of music my dad collected. Plus, it's tough to play some of these classical recordings and break them up into anything that makes sense. I had almost forgotten about this set, as a matter of fact. I'm glad I stumbled upon it because we are now on to record 3, and these are some great recordings. I've been enjoying listening to them as I continue to digitize them. Since I've thrown all show formatting aside lately, I will play most of the music on this very long playing record. I did want to read to you what the internal booklet says about the Fourth Symphony. The Fourth is not nearly so popular as the symphony that precedes or that which follows it, deservedly so. It is a pleasant work, but in spite of its many felicities, it never approaches the power of the Eroica or the intensity of the Fifth. Its most beautiful movement is the second, in which 2 apparently opposite ideas are interwoven to form a tapestry of muted and gentle colors. Okay, let's hear that long second movement now. the second movement of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, Adagio. Now let me tell you about my dad's vinyl I am spinning for this episode. Beethoven, René Lebovitz, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, the Beecham Choral Society, the 9 Symphonies of Beethoven. It's on the Reader's Digest label, number RD 4 through 6. It's a 7 vinyl LP box set format. It was released in 1966 and actually started recording this in 1961. Its genre is classical and its style is romantic choral. Now, this is record 3 of a 6-record set, and we will hear 3 movements from the 4th and 3 movements from the 5th Symphony. Now, there are extensive liner notes inside the front cover of the box set, and there is very extensive 20-page booklet included with the set, and I want to read a few lines from that booklet. What is it that sets these symphonies apart? The reason, in my opinion, is this. Beethoven took music off the pedestal of a formal beauty and immersed it in the whirlpool of life. He roughened it up, so to speak. He shook it and he pulled it until it began to do what he expected it to do. That is, to express the problems that you and I have, to evoke emotions that you and I feel, to make it move and struggle exuberantly as we ourselves do. In these symphonies, he set to music everybody's heartache and everybody's smile. He made music more human. If in this process music lost some of its aristocratic reserve, it gained an immediacy. That is why more people can respond at once to a Beethoven symphony than can respond to Mozart or Haydn. Maybe I'll eventually publish the full liner notes from this box set. They are really enjoyable and educational. Let's see what prices this record is being sold at on Discogs.com. $59.99 for a high, $10 for a low. That gives it a $29.84 average and a $25 median. It was last sold on February 5th, 2025 for $20. Now, my dad's record in this set are in fair condition, not as much crackle and pop as I expected, although it does get in the way of some of the quiet bits, but it's not too bad. Hopefully the compression isn't too much when I put this episode actually out there. The surface is really clean and for the most part, practically scratch-free. The records are protected in a quality thick paper sleeve. The box is in fair to poor condition. Quite a lot of severe wear along the wide edge of the box set. Beethoven's headshot is in blue, and it looks as if it was lifted off a $20 bill. There's also a scrape in that looks like tape had been applied and then lifted. The back is actually still pretty white. The internal booklet is in good condition and contains so much good information. So I will value my dad's box set at $10. Next up, yes, we are skipping the third movement. This is intentional. I rarely ever play an entire album. I'm just telling you this because I was attacked for not including the third movement the last time I featured this box set. bringing the Fourth Symphony to a close with the fourth movement, Allegro ma non troppo. Since we have talked about Beethoven before, I'm just going to do a quick summary of his life. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, Germany. From a young age, he showed remarkable talent for music, which his father, Johann, eagerly encouraged. His early lessons were strict, but his passion for music blossomed. And by the time he was a teenager, Beethoven was already performing for nobility and studying with famous musicians. As he grew older, Beethoven moved to Vienna, Austria, where he became a well-known composer and a pianist. He created some of his greatest works during this time, including symphonies, sonatas, and string quartets. Despite his success, Beethoven faced many hardships, including losing his hearing. By his late 20s, he began to notice signs of deafness, but this did not stop him from composing extraordinary music that is still celebrated today. Beethoven's later years were marked by both triumph and struggle. He created pieces that are now considered masterpieces, such as his Ninth Symphony, which includes the famous Ode to Joy. However, he lived a lonely life and faced ongoing health problems. Beethoven passed away in 1827 at the age of 56, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest composers in history. Okay, let's get ready to hear the four most famous notes in music history from the internal booklet. Here is the potent and concentrated and ultimate distillation of the genius that was Beethoven. That was said by Charles O'Connell in the Victor Book of the Symphony. This symphony is perhaps the most famous single piece of music there is. Within our time, it has become even more famous. The first theme having assumed an extra musical meaning and serving as a theme song for victory. Of this theme, Beethoven is supposed to have said, quote, "Thus fate knocks at the door," unquote. I am slightly suspicious of the remark. It doesn't sound like Beethoven, but true or not true, the four notes which, without any introduction, I heard at the outset and which act as a germinal theme of the music material of the first movement are now and will forever be known as the Fate motif. From this theme, which is as non-committal as any you are likely to encounter, Beethoven builds a movement in which, as in the Third Symphony, we meet the spirit victorious. Once more, we are confronted by Beethoven's belief that fate, whether knocking at the door or breaking in without warning, can be mastered. Once again, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and the Beecham Choral Society, under the direction of René Leibovitz, performing Ludwig van Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor, Opus 67. That was the first movement, Allegro con Brio. Time now for this episode's interesting side note, and it has to do with alternate endings for that first movement. I found a great video of the great conductor and music educator Leonard Bernstein discussing Beethoven's Fifth for a TV show. A small part of the video demonstrates notations he found in original manuscripts.
Is this genius of his for going forward, always forward, that guides his hand in every case when he is struggling with his material? Why, even the very ending of this movement was written in 3 different ways, right on the facsimile of the orchestra score that you saw a moment ago. The first way sounds like this. This is a typical abrupt Beethoven-ish ending. But he didn't like it. For some reason, I suspect, because he thought it was too abrupt, he wrote a second one, which he made more extended, more noble, more romantic, more majestic, more like what we tend to think of as a finale. And that one went like this. But this one too, as you see in the manuscript, is crossed out. Apparently Beethoven thought that it was too long, too pretentious, perhaps too majestic. It didn't seem to fit into the scheme of the first movement, where the keynote is bare, pithy, forthright statement of the utmost force. And so he tried still a third ending, and this one worked. But the odd thing is that, as it turned out, this third ending is even more abrupt than the first ending was. So you see, Beethoven had to struggle and agonize for all this time in order to arrive at what is apparently so simple a thing, that his first ending didn't have the trouble of being too abrupt, but rather not abrupt enough. And so out came finally this third ending, which is as right as rain. And so Beethoven came to the end of this long symphonic journey, at least for one movement. But imagine a lifetime of this struggle, movement after movement, symphony after symphony, quartet after concerto after sonata, always probing and rejecting in this constant dedication to perfection, to the principle of inevitability. Somehow this is the key, the only key we can have to the mystery of a great artist, that for reasons unknown to him or to anybody else for that matter, he will give away his life and his energies just to make sure that one note follows another with complete inevitability. It seems rather an odd way to spend one's life, but it isn't so odd when we think that the composer, by doing this, leaves us at the finish with a feeling that something is right in the world, that checks throughout, something that follows its own law consistently, something we can trust that will never let us down.
I'll drop the link to that video in this episode's liner notes. It's a great class, and it's also handy to have an orchestra along with you to teach it. Now, on to the third movement, which has a quirk of its own. One of the most astonishing moments of the symphony occurs at the end of the third movement, when it flows into the fourth without a pause. The music seems to die down completely, the drum carrying the rhythm forward while the strings spin a web in some subterranean cave. That was the third movement of the first Allegro. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. I know this one is a bit longer than usual, but I thought it was worth it to share this great recording. Now, I did just recently see the Cleveland Orchestra perform Beethoven's Fifth. It was actually a dream come true. It was my first trip to the orchestra's home Severance Music Center in February of 2024. It was the second piece of the concert. The first was Schubert's Sixth Symphony. Then, after intermission and the orchestra adding more chairs, conductor Jukka-Pekka Sariste wasted no time after barely letting the patrons settle into their seats. We heard those first four notes, and we were off. I barely noticed that more than 25 minutes had passed when the audience started applauding. I happened to be lucky enough to be sitting next to a former orchestra violinist, and he had tears in his eyes. Not only was it a dream come true, but it was everything I expected. I am so glad I took that opportunity to see this brilliant and famous piece of music performed by some of the best musicians in the world. Now, I'm not sure I remember this album cover from my growing up days in the house. My dad usually had mostly his jazz and Rat Pack albums out near the record player in the living room. I know he collected more classical music later in his life as he switched over to CDs. It is kind of a recognizable cover. Like I said when I covered the condition the box set is in, I mentioned that it basically looks like Beethoven was put on some denomination of U.S. currency, but in blue. Other than the Reader's Digest logo in the top left corner, the long title of the artist and then the album are listed in various sized serif font, some of it italicized and some of it not. The back is just white box. The white spine has gold lettering of the box set title. Before we rejoin the low timpani already in progress, I'll read the last line of the paragraph I started this break with. Suddenly, the web is torn. The walls of the cave split, and almost at once the whole orchestra bursts into a surging crescendo. the fourth movement, the continuation of the Allegro of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And there you have selections from record 3 of this great box set. So thanks for tuning into volume 227, Beethoven's 4th and 5th, however you did. If you want more information about this show, head over to spinningmydadsvinyl.com. I'll be back next week with all my skips, scratches, and pops for volume 228, a Bobby Happy Mother's Day. Until then, go with the flow, my friends.